The Atlantic Ocean had become a graveyard without tombstones, where steel giants prowled in perpetual darkness, and every shadow could mean extinction. 300 feet below the surface, Soviet submarines glided like patient predators, their nuclear warheads capable of incinerating entire cities in minutes. American sailors knew the terrible mathematics. A single ballistic missile submarine carried enough destructive power to obliterate the eastern seaboard before breakfast. NATO supply convoys crossing these waters moved like sheep through wolf territory, their crews scanning horizons that revealed nothing of the true threat lurking beneath. The Cold War had transformed the ocean, depths into humanity's most dangerous battlefield, where detection meant survival and invisibility meant victory. Every commercial vessel, every military transport, every ton of fuel crossing the Atlantic sailed above an invisible web of Soviet steel. This was the underwater front line where World War III would begin if deterrence ever failed. Soviet Naval Command had perfected the art of submarine warfare through decades of obsessive development and ruthless training. Their captains were legends in Moscow, celebrated for their ability to vanish into thermal layers and ocean currents like ghosts escaping into fog. Western analysts lost sleep calculating how many Soviet boats might be operating undetected at any given moment. 5, 15, perhaps 50 lurking in strike positions. The Kremlin's admirals smiled at NATO briefings that underestimated their capabilities, knowing their submarines practiced stalking American carriers like hunters studying deer. Intelligence photographs showed Soviet shipyards launching new submarines faster than Western nations could count them, each generation quieter and deadlier than the last. Pentagon war games repeatedly demonstrated the catastrophic vulnerability of Atlantic shipping lanes to coordinated submarine attacks. The psychological weight pressed down on every NATO commander who understood that victory in the Cold War demanded answering one impossible question: how do you find something designed never to be found? The P-3 Orion stood on the tarmac like a mechanical warhorse, bred specifically for the hunt, its 4 turboprop engines promising endurance that would outlast any submarine's patience. Engineers had transformed a commercial airliner frame into something entirely different, a flying electronics laboratory packed with technology that could taste the ocean's secrets from thousands of feet above. The fuselage bristled with sensors and antennas, each component representing millions of dollars in research aimed at solving the Soviet submarine problem that kept admirals awake at night. Inside the narrow cabin, operators would spend 12-hour missions hunched over glowing screens in near darkness, their eyes burning as they searched for electronic whispers that betrayed steel hulls moving through salt water. The aircraft carried enough sonobuoys to carpet entire sections of ocean with listening devices, creating invisible nets that turned open water into a surveillance grid. Magnetic anomaly detectors in the tail could sense distortions in Earth's magnetic field, caused by massive metal objects passing below, reading the ocean like a fortune teller reading palms. This was America's answer to the underwater threat, not a faster submarine, but a patient, skybound sentinel that transformed the hunter into the hunted. The technology inside represented a quantum leap beyond anything the Soviets believed possible, combining radar, acoustics, and computing power into a unified system that gave American crews godlike awareness. Sonobuoy patterns could be dropped in carefully calculated formations, creating overlapping fields of detection that submarines couldn't cross without announcing their presence. Radar operators could spot periscopes breaking the surface for mere seconds, their screens calibrated to distinguish between waves and the telltale wake of steel cutting through water. The acoustic processors could analyze ocean sounds with such precision that experienced operators claimed they could identify specific submarines by the unique acoustic signature of their propellers. Radio equipment maintained constant contact with NATO command centers, allowing real-time intelligence sharing that turned individual aircraft into nodes in a vast network. Even the crew composition reflected the mission's complexity. Pilots, navigators, tactical coordinators, sensor operators, and acoustic analysts working in orchestrated precision like musicians in a deadly symphony. Every component, every crew member, every line of code in the primitive computers existed for one purpose: to make the invisible visible. Training crews for the P-3 took months of intensive schooling, where failure meant reassignment to less critical duties and success meant facing the actual enemy in conditions where mistakes cost lives. Pilots learned to fly 12-hour missions at wave-top altitude in weather that grounded commercial aviation, their skills tested against fatigue and mechanical stress that pushed both man and machine to breaking points. Sensor operators spent hundreds of hours memorizing the acoustic signatures of Soviet submarines, learning to distinguish a Victor-class boat from a Charlie-class by subtle variations in propeller cavitation. The crews developed an almost supernatural intuition about where submarines might hide, studying ocean thermal layers, underwater canyons, and current patterns like gamblers studying marked cards. They practiced emergency procedures until responses became muscle memory: what to do when a submarine surfaced directly beneath them, how to coordinate with destroyers during active prosecution, when to call for backup. Pentagon observers watched these training exercises with grim satisfaction, knowing they were forging specialists in warfare's newest dimension. When a P-3 crew received orders to deploy forward to Iceland or the Azores, they understood they were entering the real game, where Soviet captains played for keeps. The aircraft had already proven itself in dozens of Cold War confrontations that never made headlines, quiet victories in the shadow war, where success meant preventing conflicts rather than winning them. P-3 crews had tracked Soviet submarines across entire ocean basins, sometimes maintaining contact for days, while the boats below tried every evasion tactic in their playbooks. They had photographed new Soviet submarine classes during rare surface transits, providing intelligence that reshaped Western understanding of the threat. In tense moments, they had dropped active sonobuoys that announced to Soviet captains that their stealth had failed, that American eyes watched from above. The psychological impact rippled through Soviet naval command, forcing their submarines to operate with the constant paranoia that detection might come at any moment. NATO commanders began placing new confidence in Atlantic defense plans, knowing the P-3 fleet provided coverage that transformed vast empty ocean into monitored territory. Yet the Soviets kept coming, kept improving, kept testing, because the Cold War demanded it, because nuclear deterrence required both sides to push every advantage, because the game continued until someone blinked. The stage was set for a confrontation that would validate every dollar, every training hour, every technological breakthrough invested in the Orion program. The Norwegian sea turned hostile in the autumn, months when Soviet Naval Command began moving assets with a coordination that set off alarm bells throughout NATO's intelligence apparatus. American listening posts in Norway picked up encrypted radio traffic surging to volumes not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis, each transmission another brushstroke in a picture nobody wanted to see. Completed. Satellite imagery revealed unusual activity at Murmansk and Severomorsk, submarines leaving port in numbers that exceeded normal patrol rotations, their departures timed with precision that suggested planning at the highest levels. British destroyers reported fleeting sonar contacts that vanished into thermal layers before confirmation, phantom signatures that could have been whales or could have been something far more dangerous. The pattern crystallized slowly like ice, forming on glass, each isolated incident meaningless alone, but together forming a mosaic that terrified the analysts studying it. Pentagon briefing rooms filled with grim-faced officers examining charts where red symbols multiplied across the North Atlantic like a disease spreading. The Soviets were deploying their submarine fleet in strength, and nobody knew whether this was an exercise or the opening moves of something that would change the world forever. NATO commanders faced the nightmare scenario they had wargamed for years: multiple Soviet submarines, operating in coordinated formations that could overwhelm detection capabilities and threaten the sea lanes connecting America to Europe. Intelligence estimates suggested at least a dozen boats had departed their bases within a 72-hour window, an unprecedented surge that stripped the Northern Fleet's pens nearly bare. The submarines spread across the Norwegian Sea like wolves taking position before a hunt, each boat occupying a strategic zone that could interdict shipping or threaten coastal installations. Communications intercepts revealed references to a major naval exercise codenamed something unpronounceable, though analysts debated whether exercises could be covers for actual aggression. European capitals received quiet warnings through diplomatic channels: increase readiness, prepare contingencies, watch the waters. American attack submarines received encrypted orders to shadow Soviet boats when possible, creating an underwater ballet where dozens of vessels maneuvered in the dark depths, each aware of the others, yet pretending blindness. The Cold War had always been a game of chess, played with nuclear pieces, but now someone had swept their hand across the board, and all the pieces were moving at once. Iceland's strategic position as the Atlantic's gatekeeper transformed overnight, from comfortable backwater posting to frontline alert station as reconnaissance. Aircraft reported suspicious surface contacts near the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. This underwater choke point represented Soviet submarines' main corridor into the open Atlantic, where American supply ships would have to pass during any European conflict. If Soviet boats controlled the gap, they controlled NATO's lifeline, a fact both sides understood with perfect clarity. American P-3 crews received briefing updates that grew darker each day, intelligence officers pointing at maps where estimated submarine positions clustered like hornets around a nest. The Norwegian government quietly mobilized coastal defenses while maintaining public calm, their leadership understanding that panic served Soviet interests better than any torpedo. Admirals' aides worked through nights, compiling reports for Washington, each cable more urgent than the last, each requesting more assets to counter a threat expanding faster than resources could match. The ocean itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when detection became confrontation, and the Cold War's careful balance tipped towards something nobody could control. Patrol squadron operations centers transformed into 24-hour war rooms, where exhausted personnel tracked every fragment of intelligence, trying to assemble the puzzle before the picture showed something terrible. Coffee turned to fuel and cigarettes to currency as men worked rotating shifts that blurred into continuous consciousness, sleep becoming a luxury no one could afford. The squadron commander studied reconnaissance reports with eyes that burned from too many hours, staring at classified documents, knowing his crews would fly into whatever waited out there. Maintenance chiefs pushed their teams to keep every available aircraft mission ready, understanding that mechanical failure might mean the difference between detection and catastrophe. Young navigators plotted search patterns that covered thousands of square miles of hostile ocean, their calculations precise, but their hands shaking slightly as they worked. The weight of consequence pressed down on everyone. If they failed, if Soviet submarines slipped through undetected, the strategic balance could shift in ways that made future war not just possible, but inevitable. Every mission launched carried the burden of history on its wings. The emergency briefing began at 0400 hours when Commander Mitchell burst through the ready room doors with frost still clinging to his flight jacket, his breath visible in the cold air as exhausted crew members jolted awake from restless sleep on metal chairs. Maps unfurled across the briefing table showed sectors highlighted in red where sonar contacts had appeared and vanished like ghosts, each mark representing a potential Soviet submarine whose exact position remained maddeningly uncertain. The intelligence officer spoke in clipped sentences about acoustic signatures detected by Norwegian listening stations, his pointer tapping coordinates where something large and unmistakably military had passed through thermal layers deep enough to hide. Aircraft carriers. Lieutenant Commander Harris and his crew would take the bird up within the hour. No time for full rest, no luxury of waiting for better weather, just the cold reality that NATO needed eyes over those waters before dawn broke, and whatever lurked below changed position. The mission parameters were simple in concept, but terrifying. In execution, locate, identify and track any Soviet submarines operating in the Norwegian Sea approaches, maintain contact regardless of conditions, transmit findings through encrypted channels that Moscow's listeners would intercept and understand as a message. Harris felt the weight settle on his shoulders like physical mass, knowing his aircraft and crew were being sent to announce American presence in the most unmistakable terms. This wasn't just reconnaissance. This was a declaration that the deep ocean had no hiding places from American eyes. The weather forecast offered nothing but punishment as meteorologists described storm systems colliding over the patrol area, creating conditions where visibility would measure in yards and turbulence would test both aircraft and human endurance to their limits. Ice accumulation warnings scrolled across teletype machines, while wind speed projections climbed to numbers that made even veteran pilots exchange glances weighted with unspoken concern. Harris studied the faces of his crew, the sensor operators who would spend hours monitoring screens in the aircraft's cramped belly, the flight engineer whose expertise might be all that stood between mechanical failure and disaster, the navigator whose calculations would guide them across trackless ocean, where compass deviations could send them hopelessly off course. Each man carried specialized skills honed through countless training hours, yet none had faced a mission where success mattered this much to people who would never know their names. The tactical coordinator outlined search patterns that would take them through sectors where Soviet submarines had been estimated, emphasizing the word estimated with a tone that conveyed how little certainty existed in the intelligence. Protocol demanded they maintain radio discipline except for critical contacts, fly die enough to deploy sonobuoys effectively, but high enough to avoid surface skimming waves, and above all, remember that Soviet crews were hunting too. The briefing ended without speeches or dramatics, just nods of understanding between men who knew the ocean forgave nothing and the mission allowed no second chances. The P-3 Orion waited on the frozen tarmac like a mechanical predator, its 4 turboprop engines silent but ready, ice crystals glittering on wings that would soon carry 12 men into conditions where nature and geopolitics conspired equally toward disaster. Pre-flight checks proceeded with methodical precision as crew members moved through procedures practiced until they became muscle memory. Each switch confirmation and gauge verification, another link in the chain keeping them alive. Harris climbed into the cockpit as ground crew removed wheel chocks, the instrument panel's green glow illuminating his face, while his co-pilot ran through the startup sequence with hands that moved with practiced confidence despite the stakes. The engines coughed to life one by one, their combined roar drowning out the wind that howled across the airfield, propellers biting into air that felt solid with cold. Tower clearance came through headsets as the Orion rolled toward the runway, its navigation lights cutting through pre-dawn darkness, while inside the fuselage sensor operators powered up equipment that represented millions of dollars and years of technological advancement. The aircraft turned onto the runway alignment, engines spooling to full power as Harris released brakes and felt the machine accelerate into the unknown. They lifted into darkness, with Iceland's lights falling away beneath them, climbing toward a mission where success meant finding submarines that didn't want to be found, and failure meant consequences measured in geopolitical catastrophe. The Norwegian Sea stretched below them, invisible and hostile, as the Orion reached patrol altitude, entering the search area where intelligence suggested Soviet submarines operated with intentions that remained terrifyingly unclear. Inside the aircraft's tactical station, operators adjusted sonobuoy deployment systems while reviewing acoustic profiles of Soviet submarine classes, the characteristic sounds each boat made, the frequencies their machinery generated, the subtle signatures that distinguished military vessels from whales or fishing trawlers. Harris maintained heading while watching weather radar paint pictures of the storm systems they would penetrate, knowing that comfort and safety had been left behind on that frozen runway. The mission clock started counting as the first sonobuoy dropped into the black water below, its sensors descending into depths where Soviet crews might be listening for exactly this sound, understanding that American hunters had arrived. Every man aboard carried the knowledge that somewhere beneath those waves, submarine commanders were making decisions about evasion or confrontation, their boats capable of striking back if they chose aggression over stealth. The Cold War had always been fought in shadows, but now those shadows extended into an abyss where pressure could crush steel and darkness was absolute. They had 4 days to prove American technology could illuminate even that darkness. The first sonobuoy transmission crackled through the headsets at 0700 hours, a faint mechanical whisper buried beneath ocean ambient noise that made Petty Officer Rodriguez lean forward until his nose nearly touched the waterfall display. His trained ears detected what computers initially dismissed, a rhythmic pattern too regular to be natural, the distant throb of machinery pushing a steel hull through water that carried sound for miles in the right thermal conditions. He flagged the contact for Senior Chief Patterson, who appeared at his shoulder within seconds. Both men, watching the frequency analysis paint spectral lines that matched signatures, locked in classified databases. Victor class, possibly Victor II variant based on propeller cavitation harmonics, Patterson announced to Harris through the intercom, his voice carrying the controlled excitement of a hunter who'd just spotted tracks. The aircraft banked into a tight orbit as more sonobuoys dropped in a geometric pattern, creating an acoustic fence that would triangulate the submarine's exact position and movement vector. Everyone aboard understood the significance of this moment. Soviet submarines were designed specifically to evade detection, their engineers having spent decades perfecting stealth, yet American technology was pulling this boat from the darkness, like a surgeon extracting a tumor. The tracking began in earnest as the tactical coordinator plotted the submarine's course on transparent sheets overlaying nautical charts, each sonobuoy update refining the solution, while the Soviet captain below remained unaware he'd been compromised. Harris maintained altitude and speed calculated to keep the Orion positioned optimally, while sensor operators monitored passive systems that listened without betraying their presence through active pings. The Victor class was attempting a sprint and drift pattern, accelerating briefly before going silent to listen for pursuers, a tactic that worked against surface ships but proved useless against an airborne hunter whose sonobuoys formed an invisible net. Hours compressed into an endurance contest where crew rotation kept fresh eyes on displays while the submarine executed maneuvers that would have impressed any tactical instructor. Through the cockpit windows, dawn broke across the Norwegian Sea, illuminating waves that concealed the deadly ballet occurring in the depths, sunlight indifferent to the Cold War drama unfolding in darkness and pressure. The Soviet commander finally attempted a sprint maneuver 6 hours into the tracking, his boat accelerating to flank speed in a desperate bid to break contact, the increased noise signature blooming across American displays like a distress flare. Patterson's team adjusted their sonobuoy pattern instantly, leapfrogging sensors ahead of the submarine's projected path while maintaining continuous acoustic contact that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. Harris listened to the calm, professional voices of his crew working the problem, their coordination, reflecting hundreds of training hours that prepared them for exactly this scenario. The submarine eventually slowed, its commander perhaps recognizing the futility of evasion, settling into a steady course that suggested resignation or perhaps calculation of his own. Inside the Orion's fuselage, operators documented every acoustic detail, building a signature profile that intelligence analysts would study for years, each data point another crack in Soviet operational security. When the relief aircraft finally arrived to assume tracking responsibility, Harris's crew had maintained contact for 6 uninterrupted hours, proving beyond doubt that American anti-submarine warfare had achieved capabilities the Kremlin had hoped were exaggerated propaganda. The encrypted transmission flashed toward NATO headquarters, carrying coordinates, classification, and the unmistakable message that Soviet submarines no longer owned the depths. As the Orion turned toward base, every crew member felt the weight of what they'd accomplished, not merely finding one submarine, but demonstrating technological superiority that would echo through naval headquarters on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The ocean below remained dark and cold, but for those 6 hours, American eyes had pierced that darkness completely. The operations shack at Keflavik erupted in controlled chaos when Patterson's preliminary report arrived via encrypted telex. The mechanical clatter of the machine drawing senior officers from adjacent rooms like moths to flame. Commander Briggs read the assessment twice, his weathered face betraying nothing, while his mind calculated implications that stretched far beyond one successful submarine tracking. He ordered Harris and his crew to grab 6 hours of mandated rest before returning to patrol stations, knowing exhausted operators made fatal mistakes. But the intelligence pipeline had already begun grinding. Within the Pentagon's shadowed corridors, analysts cross-reference the Victor-class detection with satellite imagery and signals intelligence, discovering patterns that suggested the Soviet operation was far larger than initially assessed. The Cold War's invisible machinery accelerated, teletype machines chattering across secure networks, flag officers lifting red phones that connected directly to the White House Situation Room, where maps displayed the Norwegian Sea's strategic choke points. Harris barely slept, his mind replaying the hunt, while his body demanded rest it wouldn't fully receive. When the alarm sounded in the pre-dawn darkness, he found his crew already assembled in the briefing room, their faces carrying the peculiar mixture of exhaustion and anticipation that defined warriors operating at the edge of capability. The intelligence officer's pointer traced arcs across the chart, where 3 additional underwater contacts had been reported by other NATO assets. Scattered detections that individually meant little but collectively suggested coordinated Soviet movements. "They're running a major exercise or positioning for something bigger," the briefer explained, his voice flat with the professional detachment that masked genuine concern. Harris accepted the updated search coordinates while his navigator plotted fuel calculations, everyone understanding their Orion had become the primary asset in an expanding game whose stakes involved nuclear deterrence and superpower credibility that could shift wars without firing shots. The second mission launched under clearing skies that seemed mockingly peaceful, given the tension crackling through military channels. 2 hours into patrol, the mad boom operator called contact, his magnetic anomaly detector registering the distinctive signature of a massive metal hull displacing seawater deep below. Rodriguez had already deployed sonobuoys in a revised pattern that reflected lessons from the previous hunt, and within minutes his displays showed something that made his pulse quicken: multiple contacts, at least 2 distinct submarines operating in loose coordination. Patterson confirmed the classification almost immediately: a Charlie-class guided missile submarine running parallel to what appeared to be another Victor variant, both maintaining course toward the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap that Soviet strategists had studied for decades. The revelation transformed the mission from routine patrol into something approaching historical significance as Harris banked into tracking formation while encrypted. Transmissions flashed toward chain of command that reached Moscow's doorstep. By the time the third submarine revealed itself through thermal layer betrayal that carried propeller noise upward, every crew member understood they were documenting an intelligence windfall that would reshape Cold War naval calculations. The exhaustion became irrelevant, replaced by professional focus that turned 12 men into a single hunting organism suspended between sea and sky, their sensors penetrating depths where Soviet planners had believed their boats invisible. Each detection another crack in the Iron Curtain's most protected secrets. The fourth day began with meteorological reports, warning of deteriorating conditions. But Harris launched anyway because the intelligence machinery demanded answers, and his crew had become the Cold War's most valuable eyes above an increasingly crowded ocean. They were 90 minutes into patrol when Rodriguez detected acoustic patterns different from anything they had tracked previously. A deeper resonance, slower propeller cadence, the unmistakable signature of something massive moving through thermal layers with deliberate confidence that suggested either arrogance or desperation. Patterson pulled reference materials from locked cabinets, cross-referencing frequency analysis against classified profiles while his hands trembled, slightly from caffeine and adrenaline that had sustained him through missions that blurred together into one continuous hunt. The confirmation came through his headset like thunder. Yankee-class ballistic missile submarine, the crown jewel of Soviet naval power, 16 nuclear-tipped missiles capable of incinerating American cities riding silent beneath waves that suddenly felt terrifyingly thin. Harris felt ice crystallize in his chest as he absorbed implications that transcended tactical victory and entered strategic nightmare territory. This was not an attack submarine probing defenses or a cruise missile boat positioning for conventional strikes. This was a boom skipper carrying civilization-ending firepower, operating closer to NATO shipping lanes than any intelligence estimate had predicted possible. The Orion banked into tracking formation, while every crew member understood the stakes had elevated beyond career-making intelligence coups into scenarios where mistakes carried thermonuclear consequences that haunted Pentagon war games. Rodriguez deployed sonobuoys with surgical precision, creating an acoustic net that captured the Yankees' thermal wake, propeller harmonics, and hull resonance, while encrypted transmissions screamed toward command authorities whose response protocols involved scrambled fighters, attack submarines repositioning at flank speed, and conversations between men who held the world's fate in their portfolios. Patterson's voice remained steady as he fed classification data to the Combat Information Center, but his eyes betrayed awareness that they were documenting Soviet strategic deployments that suggested either exercises pushed to unprecedented aggression or preliminary positioning for scenarios nobody wanted contemplated. The Yankee maintained course with mechanical confidence, its crew likely unaware that American sensors had stripped away the ocean's protective darkness and laid bare movements Moscow believed invisible. Harris held tracking position for 4 hours until relief aircraft arrived, fuel gauges approaching minimums that would force their return. But the damage to Soviet operational security had become catastrophic and irreversible. When they finally turned toward Keflavik, the Orion carried evidence that one American crew had compromised an entire Soviet submarine operation. 5 boats tracked across 4 days, proving Western technology had achieved dominance in warfare's most invisible dimension, where nuclear deterrence calculations and superpower credibility lived or died in silent depths that suddenly offered no sanctuary from watching eyes above. The intelligence reached Moscow through encrypted channels that carried the weight of institutional failure, each transmission another hammer blow against the Soviet Naval Command's carefully constructed illusion of undersea invincibility. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov sat in his Kremlin office reviewing reports that read like tactical obituaries. 5 submarines compromised by a single American aircraft. Operational security shredded so completely that NATO now possessed acoustic signatures, patrol patterns, and deployment timelines that had cost decades and billions of rubles to develop. The photographs on his desk showed American P-3 Orions in flight, unremarkable aircraft that had somehow achieved what Soviet planners insisted was impossible: sustained tracking of multiple nuclear submarines across an ocean. Moscow considered its strategic sanctuary. Outside his windows, winter darkness pressed against glass that separated him from a city unaware how thoroughly Western technology had penetrated the depths upon which Soviet nuclear deterrence depended. The emergency session convened in conference rooms where Stalin's paranoia still haunted corners, and failure carried consequences that extended beyond mere career destruction. Naval intelligence officers presented analysis with voices that betrayed fear seasoned submariners rarely displayed, explaining how American sonobuoy networks had detected propeller harmonics through thermal layers. Soviet acoustic engineers promised would provide invisibility. Gorshkov watched commanders who had built their reputations on undersea warfare superiority struggle to explain how one foreign crew had turned the Norwegian Sea into transparent hunting grounds where billion-ruble submarines became tracked prey. The questions from Kremlin leadership cut deeper than tactical critique. They questioned the fundamental assumptions underlying Soviet naval strategy, the credibility of nuclear second strike capabilities, and whether the massive submarine fleet represented deterrence or merely expensive coffins waiting for American hunters who saw through darkness like gods observing mortals. The recriminations began immediately as institutional. Survival instincts overwhelmed collegial loyalty, and officers sought scapegoats for humiliation that would echo through intelligence communities on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Submarine commanders faced accusations of operational sloppiness, while acoustic engineers defended propeller designs that suddenly seemed inadequate against Western detection technology nobody had accurately assessed. Gorshkov knew the Americans were reading victory in intelligence reports flowing through NATO channels, understanding they had achieved psychological dominance in warfare's most critical dimension, where perception shaped deterrence calculations more than actual capability. The maps spread across conference tables showed Soviet submarines as red markers surrounded by blue tracking lines, visual proof that ocean depths offered no hiding place from adversaries who had won this round decisively. Moscow's response would be comprehensive and expensive: accelerated development of quieting technologies, revised patrol protocols, and acoustic analysis programs designed to close the detection gap that had become a strategic chasm. But the damage extended beyond tactical adjustments into the realm of superpower credibility, where confidence mattered as much as capability. And right now, Soviet Naval Command confronted the reality that American aviation crews drinking coffee at 10,000 feet commanded the undersea battlefield more effectively than submarines costing fortunes and carrying civilization-ending weapons. The Cold War's balance had shifted in ways that would reshape naval doctrines, accelerate technology races, and remind both superpowers that in this deadly game of nuclear chess, even the ocean's darkest depths could no longer hide pieces from players who had learned to see through water itself. The intelligence breakthrough rippled outward from that single 4-day hunt, like seismic waves reshaping the entire strategic landscape, transforming NATO's defensive posture from reactive anxiety into confident superiority that fundamentally altered how both superpowers calculated risk in the eternal chess game of nuclear deterrence. Pentagon analysts worked through winter nights translating the Orion crew's tracking data into doctrine revisions that would govern Western naval strategy for the next decade, understanding they possessed proof that Soviet submarines, the backbone of Moscow's second strike, capability could be found, followed, and theoretically destroyed before their missiles ever broke surface. Allied commanders in Brussels received the intelligence with relief bordering on euphoria, recognizing that American technology had answered the question keeping them awake since Soviet boomers first prowled Atlantic shipping lanes. Could the West actually defend itself against undersea nuclear threats, or were they merely hoping darkness would protect civilization from annihilation? The answer arrived in sonobuoy recordings and magnetic anomaly readings that proved the ocean's depths no longer offered sanctuary to adversaries who had bet everything on invisibility that American ingenuity had rendered obsolete through sensors, mathematics, and crews who hunted with patience wolves would respect. Soviet Naval Command responded with emergency programs that consumed resources meant for surface fleets and coastal defenses, diverting engineers from conventional projects into crash courses on propeller acoustics, hull damping, and anechoic coatings that might restore the stealth advantage Western detection systems had stolen during those 4 humiliating days. Submarine design bureaus received mandates that read like desperate prayers: reduce propeller cavitation by 30%, develop reactor cooling systems that eliminated pump noise, create hull coatings that absorbed active sonar instead of reflecting it back toward hunting aircraft that circled above like patient raptors, waiting for thermal layers to reveal prey. Training protocols changed overnight as commanders learned evasion techniques, acknowledging American capabilities. Soviet doctrine previously dismissed as propaganda, practicing maneuvers that sacrificed patrol efficiency for survival against adversaries who saw through water with clarity that turned the ocean into glass. The technology race accelerated beyond sustainable pace as Moscow threw money at problems American innovation had created, understanding that credibility in nuclear deterrence depended absolutely on submarine survivability that could no longer be assumed in seas where P-3 Orions owned the hunting grounds completely. The psychological impact cut deeper than tactical adjustments as submariners who once felt protected by crushing depths now understood they operated inside transparent mediums where foreign crews tracked their movements like scientists, observing laboratory specimens, every propeller revolution potentially betraying positions to adversaries, coordinating responses faster than evasion allowed. NATO confidence surged through exercises that incorporated anti-submarine warfare with enthusiasm replacing previous uncertainty, planners designing convoy protection strategies assuming American aircraft could sanitize ocean corridors by detecting Soviet threats long before attack positions became viable. Intelligence sharing intensified between allied nations as the Orion mission's success validated cooperative surveillance networks that multiplied Western advantages, creating overlapping detection zones where Soviet submarines found fewer shadows to hide within and more sensors waiting to classify acoustic signatures. Intelligence databases now contained in comprehensive detail that eliminated anonymity beneath waves. The 4-day hunt became legend, whispered through naval academies and intelligence briefings on both sides of the Iron Curtain, a watershed moment when technological superiority translated into strategic dominance, and the Cold War's underwater battlefield revealed its secrets to those who possessed patience, skill, and sensors sophisticated enough to read oceans like open books, where every submarine became a chapter, waiting for attentive readers who understood that in this silent war, detection meant victory and invisibility had become history's artifact rather than operational reality. The legacy of that 4-day hunt solidified into doctrine that outlived the Cold War itself, etched into training manuals and strategic assessments as the moment American anti-submarine warfare proved its worth against adversaries who had wagered civilization's survival on underwater invisibility. Naval historians would analyze those 96 hours with reverence reserved for turning points, understanding that a single Orion crew demonstrated capabilities that reshaped deterrence calculations in Washington and Moscow, proving technology could penetrate depths previously considered impenetrable and forcing both superpowers to reconsider assumptions about survivability beneath waves that no longer concealed what sensors determined to find. The mission's documentation circulated through classified channels where young officers studied tracking procedures like sacred texts, learning that patience combined with sophisticated equipment could transform oceans into transparent battlefields, where adversaries betrayed themselves through thermal signatures and propeller harmonics that American mathematics decoded faster than Soviet engineers could suppress. Veterans of that flight received quiet recognition in ceremonies where admirals acknowledged their contribution to Western security without public fanfare. Understanding some victories required silence to preserve operational secrets that continued yielding advantages long after the initial contact faded into classified history. The technological implications rippled forward through decades of maritime patrol development as engineers refined systems proven. During those 4 crucial days, building upon success that validated investment skeptics had questioned before, sonobuoys and magnetic detectors demonstrated their worth tracking submarines attempting evasion maneuvers that failed against persistence and precision. Anti-submarine warfare schools incorporated the mission's lessons into curriculum that trained generations of crews who inherited confidence their predecessors earned by finding 5 submarines, when conventional wisdom suggested such comprehensive detection remained impossible against adversaries employing stealth as their primary defense. Allied nations purchased Orions and adopted American tactics after witnessing results that transformed NATO naval strategy from defensive anxiety into offensive capability, creating multinational surveillance networks that covered Atlantic approaches with overlapping sensors. Soviet planners could never fully map or counter, despite desperate efforts to restore anonymity their submarines had lost forever. The human dimension persisted in memories carried by men who flew those missions, understanding they participated in history, though classification prevented sharing details with families who never fully grasped why certain flights mattered more than others in the endless patrol cycles that defined Cold War maritime aviation. Crew members reunited decades later at gatherings where they could finally discuss the hunt openly after declassification released their story from secrecy's prison, raising glasses to absent friends and remembering when they proved one aircraft could change strategic equations between superpowers balanced on nuclear precipices. The Orion itself became symbol of Western technological edge that bridged gaps between American innovation and Soviet numerical superiority, demonstrating quality could overcome quantity when sensors detected what sheer numbers couldn't hide beneath waves that surrendered their secrets to those who asked the right questions, with equipment sophisticated enough to hear answers whispered through thermoclines. The mission endured as reminder that Cold War victories often occurred without gunfire in silent contests, where detection meant dominance, and American crews, hunting patiently above cold northern waters, wrote chapters in survival's story that prevented chapters of annihilation from ever needing composition. Future conflicts would validate lessons learned during those 4 days as anti-submarine warfare evolved, but never abandoned principles proven when one Orion found 5 submarines and changed history without firing a single weapon, demonstrating that in nuclear standoffs, knowledge of enemy positions provided deterrence more powerful than explosions, surveillance more valuable than destruction, and vigilance more essential than violence in preventing wars that thankfully remained cold. What submarine threat keeps modern navies awake at night today? Subscribe to explore more untold Cold War stories that shaped our world.